The court smelled of old wood and older fear. The heroine stood in the middle of it, her hands folded in front of her, the tips of her fingers pressed white against the seams of her plain grey dress. Around her, the room was full. Every bench was packed with people who had come to watch. Some fanned themselves with folded paper. Some whispered behind gloved hands. The high windows let in a thin, cold light that fell across the stone floor in long grey stripes, and the air smelled of tallow smoke and damp wool and something sour underneath, the smell of too many bodies pressed into too small a space. Her name was Vivienne Ashcombe, and she was 24 years old, and she was on trial for a crime she had not done. She kept her chin lifted. Not high, just level. She had learned as a girl that lifting the chin too high looked like pride, and lowering it too far looked like shame, and both were the wrong answer in a room like this one. Level was the answer. Level, and still, and quiet. The clerk read the charges. His voice was thin, and it did not carry well, and Vivienne had to strain to catch the words. Theft, forgery, a ring of sapphires taken from the drawing room of the late Lady Marchwell, a signed letter proving the sale to a jeweller in Bath, her name at the bottom of the letter, in what looked exactly like her own hand. She felt the sound of her own breath. It was very loud in her ears. She smelled the sharp, bitter smell of ink from the clerk's desk, and under it the wax of the seal he had broken to open the papers, and under that the faint, warm smell of her own skin, which felt strange to her, as though she were a person she had only just met. Her brother Crispin had done it. She knew this. She had known it for 4 days, since the constables had come to the small cottage where she had been living since her father's death, and she had opened the door and seen their faces, and known before they spoke. Crispin had done it, and Crispin had run, and Crispin had left the letter on her writing table where anyone might find it, and Crispin had signed her name, because he had always been better at copying her hand than his own, even when they were children practicing their letters at the schoolroom desk. She had said none of this to the constables. She had said none of it to the magistrate. She had said none of it to the kind old solicitor her aunt had paid for, who had asked her 3 times if there was anything she wished to add to her defense, and each time she had looked at him and said, quietly, that there was not. Because Crispin was her brother. Because Crispin was 20 years old, and slight, and frightened, and the last person left in the world who shared her blood. Because their mother had died screaming his name in a fever 10 years ago, and their father had made Vivienne promise, on the last cold night of his life, that she would keep the boy safe. Because if she spoke his name in this room, they would find him, and they would hang him, and she would have failed the only 2 people who had ever loved her, without condition. So she stood level, and quiet, and let them read the charges. Then the door at the far end of the room opened. She did not turn to look. She had been told not to turn. But she felt the shift in the room the way one feels the shift in the air before a storm. The whispering stopped, the fanning stopped. Even the clerk lifted his head from his papers. The room went still all at once, as though somebody had passed a hand across a candle flame and pinched it out, and in the quiet she could hear the sound of footsteps on stone, one after another, unhurried. The judge had come in. She heard the rustle of his robe as he climbed to the bench. She heard the small dry sound of his hand settling on the wooden rail. She heard the clerk clear his throat and announce, in a voice suddenly much smaller than before, the name of the man who would decide whether she lived or died. His Grace, the Duke of Ravenhollow. Vivienne's breath stopped in her chest. She did not lift her eyes. She did not turn her head. She stood exactly as she had been standing, hands folded, chin level, and inside her chest her heart was doing something she had not felt it do in 6 years. It was beating so hard she could feel it in her wrists. She could feel it in her throat. She could feel it in the small hollow at the base of her skull, where the pins held her hair. Alistair. The name came into her mind uncalled, the way a memory comes when one turns a corner and smells a scent from childhood. Alistair, not Raven Hollow, not His Grace. Alistair, who had been 22 years old and not yet a duke, and not yet anything at all except the second son of a marquess with no fortune of his own, who had come to her father's small country house one summer and stayed for 3 weeks, and taught her the names of the constellations from the flat stone at the edge of the pond. Alistair, who had held her hand in the tall grass one August evening, and told her, quietly, that when he came into his uncle's inheritance, he would come back for her. That she must wait. That he would speak to her father the moment he had something to offer that was not empty. Alistair, who had never come back. His elder brother had died 6 months later. The uncle had died 2 months after that. He had come into more than his uncle's estate. He had come into a dukedom. And she had waited, and waited, and read the papers, and heard nothing. And 1 year had become 2, and 2 had become 3, and finally her father had sat her down at the kitchen table and told her, kindly, that a duke did not marry a squire's daughter. And she had known he was right, and she had put the memory into a small box at the back of her mind, and she had not opened it since. Now the box had opened itself. She lifted her eyes, very slowly, and she looked at him. He was not the man she remembered. He had been slim, then, and browned by the summer, and his hair had been a little too long, and had fallen across his forehead when he laughed. This man was heavier. Not fat, not soft. Heavier in the way an old oak is heavier than a young one. His shoulders under the black robe were broader than she remembered. His hair was cut short, and had grey in it at the temples, though he could not yet be 30. His face was set and still, and his mouth had a shape she did not remember, a small, tight downturn at the corner, as though he had spent 6 years disappointed, and had learned to wear it well. He did not look at her. He was arranging papers on the bench. His hands moved, with quiet certainty. His fingers were longer than she remembered, or perhaps she had never noticed. She noticed now. He turned a page. He turned another. He read something. He set it down. Then he lifted his head, and his eyes found her, and his face did not change. He did not know her. She saw it in the same instant she saw his eyes. He looked at her the way he looked at the clerk, the way he looked at the constable at the door, the way he looked at the panelling on the far wall. A steady, weighted, professional look. Nothing more. Something inside her chest folded quietly in on itself. Of course, she thought. Of course. He had been 22. She had been 18. He had grown into a duke, and she had grown into a woman in a grey dress on a stone floor, thinner than she had been, paler, with her hair pulled back in a way that pulled her whole face tight. 6 years had done to her what 6 years does, and there had been so many summers, and so many houses, and so many girls of 18. She had told herself, once, that she had been the only one. She saw now that she had told herself a story. He was still looking at her. His eyes moved across her face. He was not searching, only looking, the way a judge looks at any defendant before proceedings begin. His gaze passed over her forehead, and her cheekbones, and her mouth. It rested for a fraction longer on her mouth than on the rest, though perhaps she imagined that. Then he looked down at the paper on his bench. "Miss Vivienne Ashcombe," he said. His voice was the same. It was lower now, and it carried in a way it had not carried before, but it was the same voice, and when he said her name, She felt the sound in the middle of her chest like a small stone dropped into still water. "Yes, Your Grace," she said. Her voice came out steady. She did not know how. She thanked whatever cold and stubborn thing lived inside her that had held her upright through her mother's dying, her father's dying, her brother's ruin. It held her upright now. His eyes lifted. They came back to her face. He looked at her for a long moment. Something moved behind his eyes. Very small. So small, she thought she had imagined it. A flicker, a small, still pause, as though he had heard a note of music from another room and did not quite recognize the tune. Then it was gone. "You are charged," he said, "with the theft of jewellery belonging to Lady Marchwell and with the forgery of a letter of sale. How do you plead?" The room was so quiet she could hear the small, dry click of the clerk's pen against the inkwell. "Not guilty, Your Grace," she said. He nodded once. He made a note. He did not look at her again. The morning went on. The clerk read the letter aloud. The jeweller from Bath was called, and gave his evidence, twisting his hat in his hands and glancing at Vivienne with a small, pinched look that was neither cruelty nor kindness, but something meaner. The look of a man who had come a long way to say something inconvenient and wished he had not been asked. He described the woman who had sold him the ring. He said she had been slim and dark-haired and had worn a grey travelling cloak. He said she had spoken quietly. He said she had signed the letter without hesitation. He said, when asked, that yes, the woman standing in the dock might be the woman, though he could not be certain, as the light had been poor in his shop and the visit had been brief. Vivienne stood through all of it, level, quiet, still Alistair, on the bench, wrote and listened and asked from time to time one short, precise question that cut through the jeweller's twisting speech like a blade through cloth. He did not raise his voice. He did not seem angry or interested or bored. He was a man doing his work. Once, when the jeweller had said something particularly foolish, Alistair paused and looked, and his eyes touched Vivienne's for less than the space of a breath before they moved on. Something in that touch was not the judge looking at the accused. Something in it was a man remembering, without wanting to remember, the shape of a face in the tall grass. But then it was gone, and he was writing again. They adjourned for the noon meal. Vivienne was taken down a narrow stone staircase into a small cold room beneath the courthouse. The room had one bench and one window set high in the wall, and the window let in a square of grey light and the sound of horses in the yard beyond. A guard brought her a piece of bread and a cup of water, and set them on the bench beside her. "You eat," he said, not unkindly. Long afternoon. He shut the door. She did not eat. She sat on the bench with her hands in her lap, and she looked at the square of grey light on the wall, and she thought about her brother. Crispin had been 7 years old the first time he had taken something that was not his. A silver spoon from their aunt's dining room. He had not known why he had done it. He had cried when their father found it under his pillow, and their father had beaten him, not cruelly, but firmly, and had made him give the spoon back and apologize. He had promised he would not do it again. He had done it again. He had done it many times. A ribbon from a shop in the village when he was 10, a pocket watch from a schoolfellow when he was 14, small money from the housekeeper's tin when he was 16. Each time he had been caught, or nearly caught, and each time their father had grown quieter and colder, and each time Vivienne had stood between them, because she had loved the boy, and because she had promised. The sapphires were only the largest of the things Crispin had taken. She had discovered him with them the day before the constables had come. He had been sitting on the floor of the cottage kitchen, the ring in his palm, weeping. He had told her, in short, broken sentences, that he had gambling debts he could not pay, that the men would kill him if he did not pay them, that he had thought he could sell the ring and put the money right before anyone knew, and that he had been a fool. She had asked him where he had taken it from. He had told her. She had asked him whose name he had used on the letter of sale. He had looked at the floor. She had understood then. She had gone very quiet, the way she always went when a thing was too large to feel all at once. She had told him to leave. She had told him to go far and go quickly, and not to tell her where. She had given him the small purse of coins she had been saving. She had watched him gather his coat and his boots. She had stood at the cottage door and watched him walk down the lane in the fading light, and she had thought, with a strange calm, that she would probably never see him again. The constables had come the next morning. She heard footsteps outside the small stone room. The door opened. The guard leaned in. "Time," he said. She stood. She smoothed her grey dress. She did not touch her hair, because touching one's hair made one look nervous, and she did not intend to look nervous. She followed the guard back up the narrow stairs. The courtroom smelled worse in the afternoon. The bodies had warmed the space. There was the sweat of many people, and the leather of the benches, and the strong, sharp smell of the pipe some man in the back had been permitted to light. Her stomach turned. She kept her face still. She stepped into the dock. Alistair was already at his bench. He did not look up when she came in. The afternoon began with the reading of testimonies from Lady Marchwell's household. A footman had seen a woman in a grey cloak in the drawing-room the night the sapphires disappeared. The housekeeper had noticed the ring missing the next morning. The butler had found the drawing-room window unlatched. All small things, none of them fitting Vivienne precisely, but none of them ruling her out either. Then the prosecutor rose and made his speech. He was a fat, red-faced man with a voice that liked itself. He spoke for nearly an hour. He said that Miss Ashcombe was the daughter of a ruined squire, that her family had lost their small fortune years ago, that she lived alone in a cottage on the edge of a village and had no visible means. He said that a woman in her position, faced with debts and hunger, might do many things. He said the letter was in her hand. He said the jeweller had described a woman answering her description. He said that decency and law required that she answer for the crime. Vivienne stood through it. Level, quiet once, in the middle of the prosecutor's speech, she felt Alistair's eyes on her. Not lingering, not searching, just a brief pass, the way one glances at the hands of a clock. She did not look at him. When the prosecutor sat down, Alistair asked her, in his quiet, even voice, whether she wished to speak in her own defence. She said yes, Your Grace. He nodded. He waited. She had prepared nothing. She had known she would not be able to prepare anything, because the only defence she had was her brother's name, and she would not give it. So she stood in the dock, and she looked at a spot on the wooden rail in front of her, and she said the words as they came. "I did not take Lady Marchwell's ring," she said. "I did not enter her house. I did not sell anything in Bath. I did not sign the letter that has been read to this court." She paused. She breathed. She smelled the tallow and the wool and the sour bodies. She heard, somewhere in the room, a woman cough into a handkerchief. "I cannot prove any of this," she said. "I have no witnesses. I was alone at my cottage on the night the ring was taken, and no one saw me there. I have no letters, no receipts, nothing that would show where I was. I am a woman living alone, and my word is all I have. I know how little it weighs." She lifted her eyes then. She lifted them because it seemed cowardly not to. She lifted them, and she looked at him. He was already looking at her. "I am not asking this court to believe me, because I am respectable," she said. "I am asking this court to believe me, because I am telling the truth." The room was quiet. She could hear her own breath. She could hear the small tick of a clock somewhere behind the bench. His face did not move. His eyes did not move. He looked at her for what felt like a long time, and inside her chest she felt something she could not name, something that was not fear and not hope, but the sharp, painful thing between them. Then he lowered his eyes to his papers, and he said quietly, "Thank you, Miss Ashcombe. You may sit." There was no chair. She had known there was no chair. She remained standing. He knew she was standing. He did not look up again. The rest of the afternoon passed in a blur of small matters. The prosecutor said a few more things. The old solicitor her aunt had paid for said a few more things, gently, without much force, because he had nothing to work with. The clerk read out the summary. Alastair listened. He made notes. He asked no more questions. At the close of the day he rose from the bench, and the room rose with him, and he said, in his even voice, that he would deliver his judgment in the morning. Then he left. Vivienne was taken back down the narrow stairs. That night, in the small holding cell in the town gaol, she lay on the wooden bench with her back against the stone wall, and she looked at the ceiling. There was no candle. The only light came from a torch in the corridor outside her cell, and it fell across the stone floor in a long wavering shape. The floor smelled of old straw and damp lime. Somewhere down the corridor, a man was crying, quietly and steadily, as though he had been crying for a long time and had forgotten why. She thought about her father. He had loved Alastair. He had not said so, because he had been a proud man and a careful man, but she had seen it in the way he had drawn Alastair into conversations at the dinner table, in the way he had lent him a horse for the long ride home, in the way he had shaken his hand on that last afternoon and said, "Come back and see us, my boy. Come back." Alastair had said he would. She turned her face to the wall. She did not weep. Weeping was for people who had time. She had one night, and she needed the night to think. They would hang her in the morning, or they would not. She did not know which. She thought it would depend on the mood of the man who was to judge her, and she did not know that man anymore. The man she had known would not have hanged her. The man on the bench she could not read. She thought about her brother. She wondered if he had reached the coast. She wondered if he had found a ship. She wondered if he had eaten. She thought, for one long moment before she made herself stop, about a flat stone at the edge of a pond, and a boy of 22 lying on his back with his hands folded behind his head, pointing up at the sky and telling her the name of a star. She had not thought of that stone in 6 years. She closed her eyes. The gale was cold. Her breath came out in small white clouds, and the stone bench bit through the thin cloth of her dress. She curled her hands into her sleeves. She listened to the man crying down the corridor. She did not sleep. At the same hour, in a rented house at the edge of the town, the man who was to sentence her was not sleeping either. He sat at a small writing desk in an upstairs room. The desk had a candle on it and a pile of papers. The papers were the day's evidence, gathered by the clerk and left for his review. He had read them once through when he had come in. He had read them a second time. He was reading them now for a third. The candle guttered. He did not notice. He was looking at a single page, the letter of sale, held up to the candlelight, turning it slowly in his fingers. The signature was very good. It was so good that he had almost missed it. But he had spent one summer, 6 years ago, reading a small stack of letters written in this hand, and there was one small thing about the way she wrote the letter V that no forger, however careful, would think to catch. The tail of the V curled to the left. In the signature on the letter of sale, the tail of the V curled to the right. He set the letter down. He rested his fingers against his mouth. He looked at the flame. He had known her the moment she had walked into the room. He had not permitted himself to show it. Not to himself, not to her, not to the clerk who watched him for weakness the way all clerks watch all judges. He had turned pages. He had read papers. He had looked at her the way he looked at everyone, and inside his chest something had been happening that he did not have a word for. Vivienne Ashcombe. He had written her name 3 times in the last 6 years and burnt each letter before sending it. He had ridden past the turning to her father's house twice in the last 3 years and had not taken it. He had told himself, with all the discipline he had learned to lay across himself like a weight, that she had married a country curate long ago and was happy and did not need him. He had told himself many things. He had not told himself she would be in a dock, in a grey dress, thinner than she should be, with her hands folded in front of her like a girl at prayer, waiting to be told whether she would live. He set the letter aside. He drew a fresh sheet of paper toward him. He did not begin to write. He sat, and he looked at the flame, and he thought she had not spoken his name. Not once. Not when he had walked in. Not when he had said hers. Not when he had asked her whether she wished to speak. She had stood in the dock and looked at him as she had looked at every other man in the room. Level and still and unknowable. He understood. Of course, he understood. If she had said his name, if she had claimed knowledge of him, the whole trial would have been thrown into confusion. The clerk would have said something. The prosecutor would have leapt on it. A woman who had once known the judge, appealing to a private history, would look worse to the crowd than a woman who was a simple stranger. She had spared him. She had spared him even now, in her grey dress, on the stone floor, with a hangman's rope waiting at the end of the morning. He pressed his fingers harder against his mouth. She had not done it. He had known it without the signature, and now he had proof. But he had also seen, all through the day, the small moments where her eyes had gone somewhere else, where her mouth had tightened as though holding something back. She was protecting somebody. Somebody else had done this, and she was standing in the dock alone. He knew at the same moment he thought it, who that somebody must be. He had met her brother once, that summer, when the boy had been a thin, quick 14-year-old with clever hands and a nervous laugh. He had not liked the boy. He had not been able to say why. He remembered thinking that boys like that grew into men who did not answer for themselves. He rose from the desk. He crossed to the window. The town was dark. A single lantern burned at the crossroads. It was very cold. He thought about what he could do. He was the judge. He could throw the case out. He could declare the evidence insufficient. He could dismiss and send her home. He had the power to do these things. He also had the power not to. If he threw the case out, the prosecutor would ask why. The clerk would write to London. There would be questions. Somebody would learn, eventually, that the judge had known the accused. His name would be dragged into it. Her name would be dragged into it. She would be free, but she would not be clean. And her brother, whoever he was and wherever he had gone, would still be a thief, and the sapphires would still be lost, and Lady Marchwell would still cry for her ring. He thought about it for a long time. The candle burnt lower. In the end, he did not write a judgment. He wrote 3 letters. The first was to a man he trusted in Bath, a private inquiry man who had done work for the Raven Hollow estate before, asking him to send word by dawn courier if a young man of 20 answering to a certain description had passed through the town in the last 5 days. He gave the description carefully. Slight build. Dark hair. Nervous manner. Possibly travelling under another name. Possibly carrying a purse of small coins. The second was to the same man, sealed separately, with instructions to be opened only if the first was answered in the affirmative. The third he wrote more slowly. It was a note to the head of the Marchwell household, which he had authority to send in his capacity as judge, requesting one small clarification of an earlier statement. He wrote it plainly. He signed it. He set it aside for the morning courier. Then he sat down again at the desk, and he wrote, at last, the beginning of his judgment. He wrote 3 lines. He read them. He set his pen down. He blew out the candle. He did not sleep. In the morning, the courtroom was even more crowded than it had been the day before. Word had spread. There were people standing in the aisles now, and against the back wall, and a man had been permitted to stand on a bench at the very back to see over the heads of the others. The air was already thick, with breath and wool and the smell of the wet cloaks people had worn in from the rain. Vivienne was brought up from the cells. She had washed her face in the small tin basin they had given her. She had smoothed her hair with her hands. She had eaten half of the bread they had brought her, because she had understood, in the small dark hours before dawn, that she was not going to die today. She did not know how she knew. She simply knew. Perhaps it was the memory of that flat stone by the pond. Perhaps it was something in his voice when he had said her name. Perhaps it was only the stubbornness of a body that did not wish to give up. She stepped into the dock. She folded her hands. She lifted her chin. Level, Alistair came in. The room stood. He climbed to the bench. He sat. The room sat. He did not look at her. Before I deliver judgment, he said, in his quiet, even voice, the court will hear one additional matter that has come to my attention. The prosecutor's head lifted sharply. The clerk's pen paused above his paper. Alistair went on, without pausing. I have this morning received a communication from the household of Lady Marchwell, he said. A footman in her employ, who was not called to give evidence yesterday, has provided a statement clarifying a small matter of timing. He held up a paper. According to this statement, the drawing-room window through which the intruder is presumed to have entered was seen unlatched at 11 o'clock on the night of the theft. Miss Ashcombe was, according to her own testimony, at her cottage at that hour. Her cottage is not less than 7 hours' ride from the Marchwell estate. He paused. He set the paper down. This alone would not be conclusive, he said. Testimony as to a defendant's location can be difficult to verify. The room was very quiet. However, he said, I have also examined more closely the letter of sale placed in evidence by the prosecution. The signature has been compared to samples of Miss Ashcombe's hand held on file at the parish where she was baptized and where her father maintained property. The comparison reveals inconsistencies which, in the judgment of this court, are inconsistent with authorship by Miss Ashcombe. He picked up the letter. He held it up. The V is wrong, he said, simply, and set the letter down. The room made a small, startled sound. The prosecutor half rose from his seat. Alistair did not look at him. He looked at Vivienne. Miss Ashcombe, he said, in the light of these matters, and taking into account the entirety of the evidence heard by this court, I find that the case against you has not been proved to the standard the law requires. The charges against you are dismissed. You are free to leave this court. She did not move. She could not move. Her hands were still folded in front of her. Her chin was still level. But inside her chest, something was breaking apart. Quietly, in a way that had no shape and no sound, and she had to hold on to the wooden rail of the dock to keep herself standing. He was still looking at her. Then, in a voice that only she could hear, so quietly that even the clerk 2 feet away did not catch it, he said, The tail of your V curls left, Vivienne. It always has. He looked down at his papers. He rose. The room rose with him. He left the bench. She did not remember walking out of the dock. She remembered the guard's hand at her elbow, guiding her down the steps. She remembered the old solicitor pressing her fingers between his and saying, my dear girl, over and over. She remembered walking through the narrow corridor with its smell of tallow and damp. She remembered the door opening onto the yard, and the cold grey light of the wet morning falling on her face, and the sudden strange feeling of being outside, upright, alive. She stood in the yard with her hand against the stone wall of the courthouse. She breathed. She smelled rain, and horse, and coal smoke from a chimney somewhere across the road. She was cold. She had no cloak. A carriage stood in the yard. A footman in dark livery held the door. He inclined his head to her. His Grace requests, he said, that you allow him to see you home, Miss Ashcombe. She looked at the footman. She looked at the carriage. She looked at the door of the courthouse behind her. She said, thank you, but I shall walk. The footman did not argue. He inclined his head again. He shut the carriage door. She walked. She walked out of the yard and into the muddy street. And she kept walking, past the market cross, past the alehouse, past the small stone church with its tilted gate. The rain was fine and thin, and it collected on her hair and the shoulders of her dress. Her shoes let the wet through at once. She kept walking. She did not know where she was going. Her cottage was 15 miles away. She had no money. She had no cloak. She had no plan. She walked out of the town and along the road that led north, and after a mile she left the road for a footpath that went across the fields toward a small wood on the ridge, because she did not want to be seen. She was walking now, not because she had anywhere to go, but because if she stopped, she thought, she might not begin again. The path led up. Her shoes filled with water. Her fingers went numb. She held her hands under her arms and walked. At the top of the ridge she stopped, at last, because she had come to a stile and could go no further without climbing it, and she did not have the strength to climb it. She sat down on the lower step of the stile. She put her forehead against her knees. She did not weep. She breathed. She heard the sound of hooves behind her. She did not lift her head. She heard the hooves stop. She heard the small, soft sound of a man dismounting from a horse. She heard boots on the wet grass. He said, Vivienne. She lifted her head. He was standing 3 paces away. He had not brought the carriage. He had ridden. His dark coat was wet across the shoulders, and his boots were muddy to the knee, and he had come without a hat, and his hair was dark and flat against his head with the rain. He had not been wearing his robe. He looked, for the first time since she had seen him yesterday, like a man, and not like a judge. She stood up. Her legs were not steady. She held on to the stile. You should not have come after me, she said. Her voice was rough. She had not spoken since she had refused the carriage. She cleared her throat. I know, he said. He did not come closer. He stood in the wet grass with his hands at his sides, and he looked at her. I know, he said again. I know I should not have come. I know I should not have come 6 years ago either. I did not come 6 years ago. I have thought about that every day for 6 years. She did not know what to do with her hands. She folded them in front of her. She unfolded them. She folded them again. You are the Duke of Ravenhollow, she said. I understand. I understood then. I never blamed you for it. You should have, he said. He said it quietly, not with drama, not with self-pity, just as a small, quiet truth he had come a long way to say. The rain fell between them. She smelled the wet grass, and the horse, and the wool of his coat, and something under all of it that she had not smelled in 6 years, which was the particular warm, dry smell of his skin. She had not known she remembered it. She remembered it now. "You knew me," she said. "In the courtroom. When you came in. Yes, you did not show it." "No, why?" He looked down at his boots. He looked back up at "Because if I had," he said, "the case would have been taken from me. Given to another judge. A judge who did not know the shape of your V. A judge who did not know that you would rather stand in a dock and hang than name your brother." She went very still. "How did you know it was my brother?" she said. "I met him once," he said. "That summer. I did not trust him then, and I did not trust him now, and when you would not speak in your own defense, I knew." "It was not difficult, Vivienne," she looked at him. She looked at the rain on his hair, and the mud on his boots, and the tired, careful line of his mouth. "Where is he now?" she said, because she had to know, because it had been 4 days. He hesitated. Then he said, "In an inn in Bath. A man in my employ has been sitting quietly in the next room since yesterday afternoon. He has not been arrested. He has not been troubled. He has been watched, because I could not, in good conscience, let him vanish altogether. Whether he is arrested tomorrow depends on you." "On me?" "I have not written any report of him," he said. "I have not sent his description to any constable. The sapphires have not been recovered, but the case against you has been dismissed, and no other name has been placed before the court. If you wish him to be arrested, I will arrest him. If you wish him to be sent quietly out of the country, I will arrange it. If you wish him to be brought home and made to answer to you privately, I will send for him." She stared at him. "You would do that?" she said. "Yes, why?" He looked at her for a long time. The rain fell. Somewhere in the wood a rook called once, and was answered by another. "Because," he said, quietly, "6 years ago I made you a promise I did not keep. And this is the closest I can come to keeping it now." She sat down again on the step of the stile. She had to. Her legs would not hold her. She put her hands over her face. She did not weep. She had not wept in the cell, and she did not weep now. She sat with her hands over her face, and she breathed. And she felt the wet grass, and the wet dress, and the wet air, and she felt, for the first time in 6 years, that she was not standing alone against a very large thing. After a long while, she said, from behind her hands, "Send him out of the country. I do not want him hanged. I do not want him in a prison. I want him gone. I want him gone somewhere he cannot do this to me again, or to anyone. Yes, I do not want to know where." "You will not." She lowered her hands. She looked at him. "And the sapphires?" she said. "The sapphires," he said, "will be returned to Lady Marchwell within the week. She will be told they were recovered from an accomplice who has since fled beyond the reach of the law. She will be pleased. She likes her ring. You will pay for that yourself. I have already sent the order." She looked at him. "You will pay for the ring," she said, "and you will let my brother go, and you will let the case be closed with no one hanged and no one questioned further. And in return you want—" She stopped. She had been about to say something bitter. She had been about to protect herself with a small, hard sentence. She caught the sentence in her mouth, and she looked at him, and she saw his face, and she did not say it. "I want nothing," he said. He said it with such quiet certainty that she believed him at once. "I did not come after you today," he said, "because I wanted something. I came after you because you were walking in the rain without a cloak, and because I have not, in 6 years, learned how to sit in a house while you walk in the rain without a cloak. That is all." He shrugged out of his own coat. He crossed the distance between them, and he laid the coat across her shoulders. It was heavy and warm from his body, and it smelled of rain and wool and the faint dry smell of his skin. He did not touch her. He set the coat, and he stepped back. "I have a carriage in the road below," he said. "It is my own carriage. It has no crest. You need not be seen in it if you would rather not. It will take you home. There is a woman in it, a housekeeper from my estate, an older woman, I trust. She will sit with you the whole way if you wish, or she will sit up with the driver if you would rather be alone. Whichever you prefer." She looked at him. "And you?" she said. "I will ride back to town. I have not yet formally closed the day's business. I must return to the courthouse." "When?" He paused. "When?" he said. "When will you come?" she said. "To see me?" He looked at her. His face did not change exactly, but something in his eyes did. Something that had been very carefully held in place for 6 years let go a little. "Whenever you tell me to," he said. She thought for a moment. "Not today," she said. "I need today for myself." "Yes, not tomorrow. No, the day after tomorrow. In the afternoon. Come to my cottage. Not in your robe. Not with your carriage. Come on your horse. Come as—" She stopped. She swallowed. "Come as you came the first time." He nodded once. She pulled his coat closer around her shoulders. She stood up. She was steady now. "I did not know," she said, "that you would come today either." He did not answer. He did not need to. They walked down the slope together, not touching, not speaking. His horse was waiting at the road, its head bent over the wet hedge. The carriage stood a little further along, a plain dark carriage with a plain dark driver and a woman's face at the window who nodded gravely to her as she approached. Alistair opened the carriage door himself. He handed her up. He did not kiss her hand. He did not look at her too long. He simply steadied her elbow and let her go and shut the door. The carriage moved off. She looked back through the small rear window once. He was standing in the road beside his horse. He was not moving. He watched the carriage until it turned the bend, and then he was gone from view. She sat back against the seat. The older woman across from her offered a folded travelling rug. She took it. She spread it across her knees. She looked out at the wet fields going by. She did not think, on the ride home, about the trial. She did not think about the dock, or the letter, or the sapphires, or her brother, though she would think about all of these things in the days and weeks to come. She thought instead about a flat stone by a pond, and a boy of 22 lying on his back with his hands folded behind his head, and the sky full of stars. 2 days later, in the late afternoon, he came. Her cottage stood on a small lane at the edge of a village called Merrowfield. It had a low front gate, and a hedge of hawthorn, and a plum tree by the door. She had swept the front step that morning. She had washed her hair. She had put on a dress that was not grey. It was pale blue, and it had been her mother's, and it did not quite fit her. But it did not matter. She heard the horse before she saw it. She was in the small kitchen at the back of the cottage, kneading a small loaf of bread, because she had needed something for her hands to do. She stopped when she heard the hooves on the lane. She wiped her hands on the cloth. She untied her apron. She smoothed her hair. She opened the front door. He was tying his horse to the gate. He had come, as she had asked, in ordinary clothes. A dark riding coat. Plain boots. No robe. No livery. No sign of a duke about him at all, except the quality of the horse and the small square of white at his cuffs. He turned when he heard the door. He looked at her for a long moment across the small front garden. Then he came up the path. She stood aside. He stepped in. She shut the door behind him. The cottage was small. 2 rooms downstairs, 2 above. The front room had a fire, and 2 chairs, and a small square table by the window. She had lit the fire that morning. It smelled of applewood and warm stone. There was a jug of late roses on the table, roses she had cut from her own hedge, and a plate with 2 slices of yellow cake she had baked the day before. He looked at the fire. He looked at the roses. He looked at the plate of cake. "I have not been in a cottage like this," he said, quietly, "in 6 years. "No," she said. He turned toward her. They stood in the small front room of the small cottage, and the fire crackled behind them, and the smell of the applewood and the roses and the warm cake filled the space between them, and neither of them moved. She could hear her own heart. She could hear the small dry sound of his breath. She could smell the rain that had come in with him on the shoulders of his coat, and beneath it the wool, and beneath that the faint, warm, dry smell of him she had known when she was 18. She lifted her hand. She did not know she was going to do it until she had done it. She lifted her hand, and she laid it, quite gently, quite carefully, against the side of his face. Her fingers touched his cheekbone and the small rough place where he had not shaved perfectly that morning. His face was warmer than she had expected. He did not move. He looked at her. He lifted his own hand slowly, and he laid it over hers. That was all. They stood like that for a long time. The fire popped. The clock on the mantel, which had been her mother's, ticked steadily. A bird called somewhere outside the window. He did not lower her hand. She did not lower his. At last she said, quietly, "There is tea." He said, yes. She took her hand from his face. He let her. She turned and went into the kitchen. He followed. He did not sit at once. He stood in the doorway and watched her measure the leaves into the pot, and pour the water, and set the pot on the small iron trivet on the range. She felt him watching. She did not mind. She felt, for the first time in 6 years, that being watched by him was not a heavy thing, but a warm one. The way sunlight is warm on the back of the neck in the first true afternoon of spring. When the tea was ready, she carried the pot into the front room and set it on the table between the 2 chairs. He sat then. He sat in the chair by the window, and she sat in the chair by the fire, and she poured his tea and passed the cup across to him. Their fingers touched briefly on the saucer. Neither of them looked away. He took the cup. He set it down without drinking. "Vivienne," he said. "Yes, I have to tell you," he said, "why I did not come back." "You do not have to. I do." She waited. He looked down into his tea. "When my brother died," he said, "and then my uncle, and I came into the title, I thought at first I could come at once. I thought, 3 months to settle the affairs, and I will ride to Merrowfield, and I will speak to your father. But the affairs did not settle in 3 months. My uncle had left the estate in ruins. There were debts I did not know about. There were tenants who had not been paid for a year. There were 3 lawsuits in Chancery. There was a sister of my uncle, a woman of great malice and long memory, who informed me on the day of the funeral that if I attempted to marry beneath my station, she would ruin any woman I chose." He paused. He took a small breath. She said. He went on. "I will make certain that any little squire's daughter you drag into that house dies alone in a corner of it, and I will pay for the funeral myself." Those were her words. She said them to me at the graveside of my uncle. She meant them. Vivienne set her cup down very carefully. "I believed her," he said. "She had the money and the will and the reach. I could have fought her. In time. But I could not fight her in 3 months. I could not fight her in a year, and every month that passed, I told myself, 1 more month, and then I will go. And then it was 2 years, and I told myself you would not want me any more. And then it was 3. and I heard from a man I trust that you had refused 2 offers of marriage in the village, and I did not know why, and I did not have the courage to hope it was for me. And then it was 4 and 5, and I could not think of what I would say when I saw you, and I did not go. That is the truth of it. There is no better answer. I was a coward. He set his cup down. He looked up. I have not been a coward in anything else, he said. I have been many things. I have not been a coward in anything but this. In this I was a coward for 6 years. Vivienne looked at him. She looked at him for a long time. Then she said, very quietly, "The woman. Your uncle's sister. Where is she now?" He said, "Dead 2 years. And her money?" "Went to her cats. She had 3. They live very well." She laughed. She could not help it. It came out of her small and surprised, and it broke something open in the room. He looked at her, and something in his face broke open too, and for one moment, sitting in the 2 chairs on either side of the small square table with the cooling tea between them, they were not a duke and a woman who had stood in a dock. They were a girl of 18 and a boy of 22 on a flat stone by a pond, and the years between had thinned to nothing. Then the moment passed, because moments do, and they were themselves again, older, wearier, with more between them than there had been. He said, "I do not ask you to answer today. I do not ask you to answer this month. I have been the shape of a stranger to you for 6 years. I will not stand up from this chair and expect to be anything else in an afternoon. No. But I will come," he said, "whenever you say. I will ride here as often as you will have me. I will not bring the carriage, or the crest, or the men. I will come as I have come today, on the horse in these clothes to this door, and when you are ready to tell me whether I am to keep coming, or to stop, you will tell me, and I will do as you say." She looked into her tea. She looked at the fire. "Come Sunday," she said. "In the afternoon. I will have made another cake." "Yes," he smiled. It was the smallest smile. It reached his eyes. He stayed for another hour. They did not speak of the trial again. They did not speak of her brother, who was, at that moment, on a ship out of Bristol, with a small purse and a false name, and a letter from Alastair's man of business promising him a modest allowance for as long as he stayed abroad and away from any table where dice were rolled. They did not speak of Lady Marchwell's ring, which was on its way back to her by discreet courier, wrapped in a note that expressed his Grace's regret at the misunderstanding and his hope of her continued good health. They spoke, instead, of small things. A book she had been reading. A dog he had at the estate that had lost the use of its back legs and dragged itself about the courtyard on a small wooden cart he had made for it. She laughed at that. He said, quietly, that he had not made the cart himself, that a groom had made it, but that he had thought of it, and she said that thinking of it was almost the same thing, and he said no, it was not, but that it was kind of her to say so. He did not tell her, because he would never tell her himself, that a fortnight earlier he had ridden 6 hours out of his way to find a particular clockmaker in a village she had once mentioned, because he remembered she had said, in the tall grass one August, that her mother had had a small enamel clock painted with hawthorn blossoms, and that it had been sold with the rest when her father had been ruined. He did not tell her that he had bought that clock from a private collector, or that it now sat in a box in a locked drawer in his study, waiting for a day he did not yet dare imagine, when he might place it on her mantelpiece and say nothing about how it had come to be there. She would learn of the clock, in time. But not from him. She would learn of it from the old housekeeper who had sat in the carriage with her that first afternoon, and who would let it slip, one evening months later, over a pot of tea in the kitchen of a house that was by then Vivienne's own. And Vivienne would sit very still with her cup halfway to her lips, and she would understand more clearly than any speech she had ever made, what kind of man she had been given back. But that was months yet, and other things had to come first. The village had to grow used to the sight of the dark horse at her gate on Sunday afternoons. The old solicitor had to be paid, quietly, from Alastair's own purse and without her knowledge, until she found out and was cross with him for a week and made him promise never to do such a thing again, without asking. Her brother had to write, from a port in Portugal, a short and clumsy letter of remorse that she read once and folded away and did not answer. Though, she kept it. And she and Alastair had to sit in the 2 chairs on either side of the small table many more times before either of them said, out loud, the word that had been waiting between them since the afternoon of the trial. When he did say it, at last, it was on a Sunday in the following spring, and they were walking in the lane behind the cottage, and the hedge was full of new leaves, and she had her hand tucked into the crook of his arm the way a girl walks with a man she has known a long time. He stopped. He turned her toward him. He said, "Vivienne, marry me." She looked up at him. The sun was behind him, and she had to squint a little to see his face. "Yes," she said. That was all. That was all either of them needed. He drew her hand up and pressed it, briefly, against his mouth, and then he tucked it back into his arm, and they walked on. They were married in Merrowfield, in the small stone church with the tilted gate, on a morning in June. There were more people at the wedding than the church could properly hold, because the whole village had come, and half of the neighbouring village too, and a great many people from London who had heard, at last, that the Duke of Ravenhollow was to marry a woman from a country cottage, and who had come to see her for themselves. Some had come to sneer. They did not sneer for long. She wore a simple dress of pale ivory and a small circle of hawthorn blossoms in her hair, and she walked down the aisle on the arm of the old solicitor, who wept quietly the whole way, and she stood in front of the altar with her hands folded in front of her, level and quiet and still, and when the priest asked her the question, she said, in a voice that carried to the back of the church, "I will." Some among the London guests remembered, afterwards, that they had seen her before, in a courtroom, in a grey dress, standing on a stone floor. They said so, quietly, behind their hands. But they said so with a kind of awe now, not with cruelty, because they had seen her stand then, and they saw her stand now, and they understood, at last, that she had been the same woman both times, and that whatever else the world had done to her, it had not bent her. And Alastair, standing beside her at the altar, in a plain dark coat, with no robe about him and no bench above him, looking down at the small determined face of the woman he had almost lost twice and had somehow been given back, understood the same thing, and understood also that he did not deserve it, and did not need to. Some gifts are not deserved. Some are only received, and kept, and paid for slowly, over the whole course of a life, in small quiet acts that no one else sees. He would pay for his, over the years that followed, in exactly that coin. And she would pay for hers, though she did not think of it that way, in the same coin, and the coin between them would grow and grow, in a house that smelled of applewood and roses, with a small enamel clock painted with hawthorn blossoms ticking on the mantelpiece, and a dog with a small wooden cart dragging itself contentedly across the flagstones of the yard, and Sunday afternoons that stretched into evenings that stretched, at last into whole lives, lived in the warm and steady light of a fire that neither of them ever again had to sit beside, alone. Thank you for staying with this story until the very end. If this moved you, please like, share, and subscribe. Your support keeps these stories alive.